it really underlined the fact that our natural world just cannot cope with our current systems of production and consumption, and something has to change in the way we do business. And the evidence of last Tuesday's trip suggested very strongly that we need to put our relationship with and dependence on nature right at the very heart of that change. And that really leads me on to today's speakers, Rory and David. So Rory is seconded to RSPCA as the lead for the Citizens Assembly that led to the People's Plan for Nature. He's a marine biologist by training, and he's worked in nature conservation for 16 years, including almost a decade working with teams of experts to prevent seabird deaths in fisheries from Iceland to Namibia. So Rory sees people as the solution, not the problem. And that was the driving force behind his involvement in the People's Plan for Nature. So over to you, Rory. I don't know whether you want to start by explaining a bit about what People's Assembly for Nature is, and perhaps if you're happy to introduce David to everyone when you're ready to do that.
Sure thing, and I'm just sharing my screen now. Hopefully you can see a puffin with some vegetation in its mouth. I'll stick my presentation up. We're going to do a sort of seamless, it will definitely be seamless transition from my bit of the presentation to David and then back to me for the last couple of slides. So hopefully that'll work well. And thanks very much for that introduction as well. So let me just get this presentation up. Can you see that? Okay, Richard, yours is the face that I can see here. So yeah, that's great. So yes, thank you for having us. I'm going to start by saying my head's not normally this shiny. I'm a bald man, but I don't know what it is with the lighting in this room, but I promise you it's not always this shiny. I've not especially buffed it for the occasion. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. I've had that introduction very helpfully. Richard explained exactly what I do. And yes, I'll be handing over to David Colver shortly. David's an Assembly member, and it's only right that most of this presentation comes from him. I'm sure he'll give a bit of background as to who he is when he comes as well. That's his job title there, working for Operis, and he can tell you a bit more about what his organisation does as a co-founder and CEO. But yes, in this context, also an Assembly member of the People's Assembly for Nature, which created this People's Plan for Nature. So I'm going to start by answering this question: why do we need a People's Plan for Nature? And I think it's probably worth knowing at the outset here that this has been powered by the RSPB, National Trust and WWF. So I'm hosted in RSPB. That's where I've worked for those 16 years in nature conservation. And these are three very big nature conservation NGOs. And the timing of this process was that it was published, the plan itself, and the Assembly was run in the preceding months leading up to this. Just as UK wildlife was really in the spotlight on BBC TV. So you might have seen the Wild Isles series on the BBC that was being narrated by David Attenborough. RSPB and WWF were quite involved on the production side of that series being in the TV. First time that UK wildlife's really been showcased on one of these blue chip documentaries narrated by David Attenborough. And it was great. If you didn't get a chance to see it, it's all on the iPlayer. It's well worth going back and watching, just some remarkable stuff. But the threats are there as well, and those threats are real. And these three big NGOs, and I say this as somebody who's worked in one in different areas for a number of years. I've worked in policy, I've worked on reserves, I've worked in people engagement. Latterly, I've been working as sort of project management on the marine conservation side. You know, we've got science experts, policy experts, land in the form of reserves, communications machines. It won't be news to anyone that all of this effort and capacity, ultimately it's to some extent not worked, because we've got a biodiversity crisis that's incredibly serious in this country. Now, that's not to dismiss all the remarkable things that have been achieved, species brought back from extinction, sites properly protected and restored. But really the overall picture, we have to be frank, is a mess. We're one of the least biodiverse nations on the face of this planet. We're world beaters when it comes to dismantling our life support system, because that's what nature is. It's giving us the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food that we eat. So it's fundamental. And I think it's important that it's seen that way. And it probably goes without saying for this audience, and you know, kind of pays into Richard's introduction there, that not having a functional life support system isn't very good for business, frankly, quite apart from anything else. So how do we bust out of this? And clearly, I think we've got to do things differently. And action comes from agency, it comes from engaging people, and it comes with a powerful public voice that says this stuff matters. And I think, importantly, not just the usual suspects. You would expect the National Trust, the RSPB, WWF to be saying, let's look after nature. What about people from all walks of life? And that's really the essence of why we need a People's Plan. So the first element of the People's Plan process was something we called the National Conversation, which sought to get sort of ideas and input from right across the country. So this was through online submissions and also in person. We had these trees. You can see there's a picture of a cardboard tree just in the bottom right-hand corner there. We put these in community centres right up and down the country. That's the locations just on that map there, and asked people to tell us what they loved about nature, what they'd miss if it was gone, and to point out any exciting examples of nature protection and restoration work that they were aware of. And also we encouraged them to imagine what would be different about thriving nature in the UK in 2050. So to get that forward look as well. So we received around 30,000 responses to those questions. And some of the key themes that sort of came through were about the health benefits of nature and its fundamental importance to our existence. And the visions of the future kind of pointed to new ways of running our economies, more bottom-up action for nature, and changing the way we think about green spaces. This is a very small snapshot. You can go on the People's Plan for Nature website and see a bit more of what was generated by that national conversation. But this is some of the key themes that came through there. And then this national conversation fed into a citizens' assembly, and this was essentially a mini UK sort of representative across age, gender, ethnicity, education level, the four nations, urban and rural, a proper mix. And these 100 folk, actually 103 people went right from the start of the assembly to the end, came from a mail out to 33,000 people. Which was a sort of democratic lottery process that was run by an organisation called the Sortition Foundation. And folk went to all sorts of lengths to be at the assembly. So some folks who'd never travelled beyond their local authority area, some who were on a train for the first time, some people who hadn't travelled at all during the pandemic, all because they felt that it was important their voice was part of this conversation. And that in itself is a humbling thing to think people would want to come together and to talk about these issues. And this was the question that folk focused on. What should we do to protect and restore nature in the UK? And these are some of the key system actors that we were encouraging folk to consider in those conversations. Now, the Assembly had 4 weeks worth of content to get through between November 2022 and February this year. We didn't design that in a silo. So first of all, I should say that the process of the Assembly was run by Involve. You can see their logo up there. They're experts in participatory processes. They ran the UK Climate Assembly, if you've heard of that one, which was commissioned by a parliamentary committee at Westminster. There's the Scottish Climate Assembly they ran, and they run their smaller participatory processes locally. So they were involved in sort of talking about what should be in the content and the design and how much people were capable of getting through in 4 weekends. And more detail on the content and what was coming up in the weekends was strongly guided by an independent advisory group. And these are some of the folk that were on that group. Now, this advisory group was headed up by two academic leads from Oxford and Aberdeen unis. That's Professor Nat Seddon, you can see smiling in that wee picture up in the top. And I can get my pointer over there. There she is. And Professor Pete Smith from Aberdeen University. So learnings from other assemblies were such that it was deemed useful and important to have academic leads who could help shape the content and think about what was actually going in there. And then the wider advisory group was there to scrutinise the plans for the design, the speakers, the themes. There were 4 meetings of this group. A couple of those were before the process even started, and they were from a broad cross-section of society. So everything from the Country, Land and Business Association to NFU Cymru, that's the National Farmers Union, to Land Workers Alliance, to Scottish Crofters Federation, community groups, government nature representatives, experts in participatory processes. You might recognise a MasterChef winner and restaurateur in that picture, a real host of expertise and knowledge. And that role was to provide advice and guidance, check the resources that were being produced, give context to the debates and discussions being had in the Assembly and those wider debates around food production and consumption, biodiversity loss and climate change, to connect the People's Plan for Nature to other initiatives and sort of share learnings, and advise and support the delivery team in ensuring the process was accessible and equitable. So that was our brilliant advisory group. So kind of fast forwarding here, but the plan was published on the 23rd of March. Actually, I've got a slide in the wrong order, so I'm going to skip forward and then I'll come back to what was in the plan. Here's what folk heard. So here was the key content. So this is a summary overview. There was, of course, a vast amount of potential content, but with 4 weekends, it was really important to sort of hone in the key areas that people could grasp and have a meaningful discussion around. So it wasn't exhaustive, of course, it couldn't be in 4 weekends, but this is what was set out. So it was context setting in the first weekend to sort of lay out the state of nature, to highlight their solutions and to encourage participants to deploy long-term thinking. A second weekend online that went through the existing legal frameworks and protections, why these weren't functioning as intended, and some examples where they have worked and what the key learnings were from those, as well as some sort of inspiring examples of nature protection from outside and restoration outside of those frameworks. A third weekend where we honed in on food production and water use as major drivers of sort of impacts on nature in the UK, but also because these are things that people understand as fundamental needs, right? Water and food are basics for our survival. We also had a brief session on economics with Professor Ian Bateman from Exeter University and Dr. Matthew Agarwala from Oxford University presenting there. And then, Cambridge University. And a final weekend devoted entirely to deliberation. So this was about turning conclusions from the previous 3 weekends into the calls to action. So across these weekends, there was a lot of content presented from expert speakers from a variety of perspectives, obviously, ecologists, academics, but lots of farmers, the fishing industry, a supermarket, I've mentioned economists already, the water industry. These were restricted in length, and the majority of the time was really set aside for discussion among the participants. I'm just going to skip back to that slide I showed you earlier, my spoiler, which was the content of the plan. Of course, not really a spoiler if you've had a chance to get on the People's Plan website and look at it. There's 2 versions of the plan, a full report, which includes the process and the behind-the-scenes stuff, and another summary version of it. But I think that the takeaway of this is that it was calling for a sort of fundamental change in how we value nature in the UK, and including nature in decision-making at all levels, sort of recognition that it wasn't being incorporated into decision-making as it needs to be, given its fundamental importance. I'm not going to go through these line by line, but please do dig into the report and have a look at the content. And just to wrap up and to sort of lead you seamlessly into David's part of the talk here, I wanted to share a few personal stories from the assembly. You're obviously going to hear David's, but in the top left-hand corner, one of our participants, Chantel, she's a youth worker from Wolverhampton. I bumped into her in the lift as we were leaving after the first assembly weekend. She hadn't been through the whole process yet, but she said what she'd heard was going to transform how she worked with young people and doing more outside and utilising green space. She's also set up a local walking group and got her brother, who's a personal trainer, in the act as well to do some stretching with that local group, walking around in green spaces. Next, we've got Pauline from South Queensferry. She's brilliant. She came into the process thinking her views were very fixed, and found that being part of the process opened her mind and changed the way that she thought about things, which is really, it's part of the intent of these processes. Get folk in the room and have an open mind and be willing for your position to be shifted. In the top right, you can see some of the assembly members who went to speak to the House of Lords, Peers for the Planet group, and the all-party parliamentary group on the environment. And Rebecca, who's in the middle there in white, she said the assembly had given her really the most profound thing, and that was confidence, which I thought was just brilliant. And similarly, Kate, who's in the picture just below here, from a different generation from Rebecca, but says she feels now like she's got more elbows and more confidence. So brilliant to hear that as a piece of feedback. And then last of all, to cycle around to the left in the bottom middle panel there, that's from an event in Parliament that we had earlier this month, where politicians, farmers and people from across the sector came together to hear about nature. And I'll quote Daniel, who joined that panel on his experience. He says, being part of the People's Plan for Nature has absolutely changed my life, shifted my sense of what agency I have in changing the world around me, which is like, wow, brilliant. So those are a handful of stories from 103 people. Of course, everyone will have had a different experience and take on this. But I think it's worth thinking about the sort of ripple effects and potential of that. And speaking of which, I'm now going to hand you over to another of the Assembly members, already trailed, to David. So I'll stop sharing and I'll mute myself and let David come online.
Good. Let me see if I can share this. What can people see now?
Podcasts.
Good. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name's David Colver. I'm Chief Executive of a business called Operis, which I'll say a little bit more about later in this talk. We have offices in the city. You can see a bit of the Shard in the top corner of the picture behind me. If I move out of the way, you can see a little bit of a snicket between the buildings looking down at the Thames. So hardly the most rural of surroundings, but I have long been interested in politics. And as a result, I listen to a lot of podcasts with political themes. And anyone else who's interested in politics may recognize some of these. And you can see the second one down, second one along says Reasons to be Cheerful. And that is one by Ed Miliband. And one of the, do you remember him? Ed Miliband preceded Jeremy Corbyn in as leader of the Labour Party. And one of the ideas that he's mentioned several times in his podcasts is sortition. And I wonder, in fact, the word was mentioned by Rory just a few moments earlier. Sorry, I'm fiddling with this thing. Who knows what sortition is? Does anyone put your hand up if you've even heard of the word? Can't see many words. Well, many hands. Well, in a democracy, we choose our representatives by voting for them. Under sortition, they're picked at random from the population as a whole. And this is actually the way the ancient Greeks populated their parliament. We don't do it now, but there is a vestige of it left in the form of jury selection. I find it a very interesting idea. The Ed Miliband podcasts have some people arguing for it as a way of putting people in the House of Lords. Others suggest even the House of Commons might be at least part populated by sortition. And it's interesting because what we're getting by way of politicians at the moment is pretty unsatisfactory, because you have people like me who are interested enough in the subject to gather in a village hall on a wet winter Thursday to talk about leafleting their neighbours, and by that very act defining themselves as being rather odd. And they then choose from among themselves the oddest and most ardent among them, and that's what's put forward by the parties to be your political candidate. And so it's no wonder that we have some very strange people in the House of Commons. There is a wonderful journalist called Isabel Hardman who's written about this. Her book's called Why We Get the Wrong Politicians. It slightly tails off towards the end, but the beginning is wonderful. And if you're at all interested in this subject, then do read about it. So I was quite interested in this sortition idea, and I would listen in the bath to these podcasts as they talked about it. And in about 2019, sortition was used to recruit about 100 people to form what was called a Citizens' Assembly for Climate Change. And this was commissioned by various committees of Parliament to understand how much voters were willing to sacrifice in order to allow the UK to meet its climate change targets. It's actually a very difficult subject for a democracy to get people to vote for drops in their living standards. And this too was covered by Ed Miliband's podcast when it came out. And we learned that members of that assembly range from those very concerned about climate change to others who are outright skeptics and deniers that climate change was a problem. And 4 weekends of briefing and deliberation caused a sufficient convergence in the views of the people there that they were able, without hitting each other, to write a report on what they thought should be done about climate change. And the commissioning department still quote that, and ministers still mention it. So here is the page on the UK Parliament website that shows the Climate Assembly. And you can see further down, you've got somebody we all know, David Attenborough in the picture. And it shows that there were 6 select committees who commissioned this work. And you can see at the bottom the question they were asked: how should the UK meet its target of net zero? So I'd heard about this and I thought that was interesting as well. And it too was covered by the podcast. And so this was the context in which I received a letter that said that there'd been this assembly on climate change. Now there was a wish to do one on how to protect and restore nature. And the letter said, we're sending this to 33,000 households, and would you like to be considered for participation? And if I hadn't heard the podcasts, I would have thrown it in the bin. But I had heard them and I was interested. So I filled in the form, and rather to my surprise, given the odds, 33,000 to 100 members, I was selected. And so it was that I found myself in a hotel in Birmingham on a Friday evening in November. Here is the wonderful hotel. It wasn't bad, actually. And meeting my fellow members for what has been named the People's Assembly for Nature. And it was quickly apparent that many there were very motivated by the subject. And they were already volunteering for conservation groups and charities of different kinds. And I am firmly not one of those. I consider I've done something commendable when I succeed in distinguishing a parrot from a penguin. And when it comes to flowers and trees, I'm even less well informed than that. My interest was in the process, as I've described, and not particularly in the subject. And the format basically consisted of 2 or 3 talks, some by video, others in person, followed by discussion of what we've just heard in groups of 10, led by a moderator. And this was repeated on 4 Saturdays and Sundays, the first and last in the hotel, and the middle 2 by Zoom. And the operation of the conference itself was delegated to a charity called Involve, which clearly makes its business in running events of this kind. It's clear that Involve has a well-honed method for conducting these meetings. It's done it countless times, and the moderators followed their process brilliantly. But that brilliance didn't stop me coming away with quite severe misgivings about the process. Today is not the occasion for going into those, beyond saying that while sortition is an interesting way to fill an assembly, the kind of deliberative democracy in small groups promoted by Involve is no substitute for a real parliament with full-time politicians. But in spite of these doubts, I experienced the kind of convergence that people reported in the earlier climate change assembly. We heard, for example, that if you dig up a cubic meter of soil in the middle of some random British field and count how many organisms there are in it, from bacteria to fungi to seeds to insects and worms and other creepy crawlies, maybe even small mammals, you'll find that there are 30% fewer of them than there would have been in the same cubic meter 50 years ago. And what's more, not only would the number of organisms be 30% smaller, the number of species represented by them would be 30% smaller as well. In other words, 30% of the species that were present 50 years ago would have no representatives at all in that cubic meter now. They might as well, for the purposes of that cubic meter, be extinct. And you will also, those of you who are older, you don't look particularly old, most of this audience, but those of you who are older, 50 years ago, if you drove your car 100 miles at this time of year, you'd have to clean it. The windscreen and headlights would be completely spattered with bug juice. That's why cars have windscreen washers. You hardly need to use them now. And that leads to another phenomenon, which is baseline shift. If you're my age, you remember these bugs. If you're 20, you've never seen it. And for you, what we have now is the norm. But if our great-grandparents came back today and stood in a field, they would be astonished by its silence. The place was just noisier 120 years ago. For them, even the 1970s would feel bare compared with what they're used to. Every new generation thinks that what they grew up with is normal. And so we only notice a fraction of the degradation, that fraction that coincides with our adult lives. And another thing we learnt about was how much UK farmland is taken up as land for grazing cattle and for growing feed for them. In fact, I've got a map for that. If you look here, there's about 40% of the UK is what it says here, beef and lamb pastures, which is either a place where the cows and the sheep live, or it's a place where they don't live, but the crops grown on them go to feed the cattle. And there are concerted efforts being made to reduce this figure from the United Nations downwards through, because it's the only way we're going to hit the biodiversity and climate change targets. So the United Nations and national governments on downwards are trying to make us eat less meat. And if you go through London now, you will see all sorts of adverts on the underground for fake bacon, fake chicken, fake burgers. Many restaurants now offer plant-derived food. And this isn't the result of a few entrepreneurs in that sector with wacky new products coming to market, but it should be seen as a much longer run and more premeditated campaign to change our diets globally. And there's some big Silicon Valley style money heading in this direction. A key notion that we learnt about was that just as a business or a country can have a balance sheet counting its financial capital, it's possible to quantify a region's natural capital. And that capital underpins the entire physical economy, and we're rapidly depleting it. As Rory said, after the assembly, some assembly members have been to see politicians of various kinds. And we went to see the Under Minister for the Environment a week ago. And she told us that the government now is doing its planning, DEFRA is doing its planning, on the basis that biodiversity is shrinking at the rate of 2% a year. And that's clearly not sustainable and is underpinning the government's efforts to try and do stuff about it. The presentations we were given were on the website of the People's Assembly for Nature. And once I've shut up, I'll provide a link in the chat because the videos are worth looking at. They're really quite interesting, some of them. So it's not hard to hear this evidence without wanting to do something about it, no matter how supportive or skeptical our starting points were. And so the question is, what? And every person will have their own answers to that. And to me, there are three answers. First, I count it as ridiculous that if I walk to the nearest park of my house, I can name every car that I pass on the way there. Oh, look, there's a Tesla. Oh, look, there's a Ford. Gosh, look, they've changed the bumper on this model year of Ford. I hadn't noticed that they changed that. How very interesting. But when I get to the park, I can't identify any of the trees. And I guess it's that BMW has a bigger marketing budget than a birch tree does. But anyway, I'm determined to fix this and to actually know what I'm looking at. The second is that I've taken to volunteering in the nearest park, which happens to be Holland Park for me. There's a group organised by the park gardeners that meets every Saturday, once a month. And we've cleared several hundred meters of ivy in a wood to make room in which wildflowers can grow under the trees. And it's good exercise, and it's satisfying to see the results of one's exertions, because it's quite hard work, actually, particularly if you're normally sedentary and not used to it. And thirdly, I'm thinking how to direct the efforts of businesses to the subject. Businesses have more resources than individuals or even governments, and can achieve far more than any other kind of organization for addressing these concerns. And what they need to get involved is a realistic revenue model. So talking my own business, Operis gives advice on the financing of infrastructure projects. And that includes renewable generation of energy, wind, solar, and these days a lot of stuff storing the resulting energy, like batteries or hydrogen. And investors in these areas are already investing in nature in the form of woodlands. Here is one of our clients, and one of the funds they operate is this sustainable forestry company. And there's a very simple reason why they're doing that, which is that they can earn carbon credits for them. So that is the revenue model. And in the absence of such a thing, there is no business to be had. But as we already have the carbon credits. By October, there'll be a new form of credit for biodiversity. And many of you may know all a bit about this stuff much better than I do. But this is how farming subsidies are to be delivered. Now we have left the EU. Rather than rewarding the acreage farmed, the bigger your farm, the more the subsidy you got. There will now be reward not for acreage, but instead for biodiversity, for agreeing to cease to farm and to turn things into wildflower meadows and the like. And then farmers will sell the credits that they need to, or that they earn, to people who need them, and that's how their subsidy will be delivered. So who will need them? Well, it'll be house builders and the like, who'll be subject to a requirement to leave the country 10% better off in biodiversity terms than they found it. And they can either do that on the site where they're putting the building, that's unlikely because they're putting the building there, or they can do something themselves nearby, enhancing the biodiversity of some other bit of land, or they can pay the farmer to do it indirectly through these biodiversity credits. So these credits will unlock a whole industry of funds investing in things that are not currently investable. Exactly what that form that takes remains to be seen, and it's something I'm trying hard to anticipate. And my participation in the People's Assembly for Nature gives me a wonderful pretext for going and talking to relevant fund managers and insurers and so on. And separately from that, I am also seeking out conversations with people in the insurance industry, or actually more importantly, the reinsurance industry. Because one of the things we learned on the assembly was that one of the consequences of what farmers have done to nature is that it increases the chance of towns flooding. We have straightened the rivers, we have flattened the fields, and as soon as a large rain comes, it rushes across the terrain into the nearest town. So if we could reverse that by putting the wiggles back in the river and the bumps back into the land, then other things being equal, you would expect the costs faced by the people who reinsure flood risks to fall. So it may be possible to structure an arrangement which would intercept some of that saving and divert it to service long-term funding, which could pay for the necessary works to reconfigure the countryside. This idea is probably nonsense, it's probably unrealistic for all sorts of technical reasons, but talking about it may spark other ideas that are more achievable, and it gives me a reason to go and talk to relevant people in the insurance industry. So I've been offering my own time and experience in this kind of analysis on a pro bono basis to relevant bodies and to businesses and estates. I haven't yet had any takers, but I'm pretty sure I will. And I think it's an interesting area to get involved with, just as carbon and climate change would have been interesting things 15 or 20 years ago. So I think that the message here is that the opportunities for businesses to contribute is much wider than might at first appear. Setting up volunteering schemes for employees to dig or count beetles is the kind of obvious thing we can all do. But depending on your business, there may be all sorts of less obvious opportunities now emerging. For example, firms in engineering businesses could design solutions that help biodiversity, and firms in technology could make sensors to count insects or monitor plant growth. So, as I mentioned, my company, Operis, is active in project finance, and there exists the IPFA, the International Project Finance Association, which is a trade organization full of people like us. It's got bankers, insurers, property developers, oil companies, all sorts of people who use project finance. The banks that provide the debt, the lawyers, the consultants, and so on. It's got several hundred members. And within weeks of the People's Plan for Nature being published, it held its first seminar on natural capital and biodiversity loss. And that's just one example of how this theme is becoming increasingly topical. You're going to see it more widely discussed, not least because the organizations who sponsored the People's Plan are campaigning to make it so. Even the Daily Mail is covering it. So, I mean, that to me is rather amazing, but there we are. So I'll be happy to take questions on this, but I just want, before wrapping up, let's see if this will work. I'm going to play you a small clip of sound. Please wave a hand if it works in a moment, and if the sharing works. But I'll just finish by saying that there was a reception in Westminster a couple of Mondays ago, and I spotted Ed Miliband there. And by the way, he's a very good-looking fellow. He's taller than I had imagined. He's very striking in appearance. And in fact, all the politicians who were there came over really well. There is Therese Coffey, who looks like a haystack in the newspapers, but she was immaculately turned out, spoke beautifully, was funny and witty, and all the other politicians that we had the opportunity to talk to, I thought well of as well. It's really interesting to get close to them. But anyway, I took the opportunity to go over to Ed Miliband and thanking him for covering sortition in his podcast and launching me on this particular adventure. And he reported that in his own podcast a few days later. Let's see if this works. It clearly isn't working. Why not?
My reason to be cheerful is that I was at a reception organised by the National Trust, the RSPB, and the World Wildlife Fund to celebrate Wild Isles. Do you know the Wild Isles thing? There was the Attenborough and all of that malarkey.
Oh, yes, I do. I've watched some of that.
Anyway, and a very nice bloke came up to me and he said, I want to thank you, he said, because I was involved in the People's Plan for Nature. Remember the People's Plan for Nature?
Yeah, just the other week, yeah.
And one of the reasons, if not the reason I got involved, I was a listener to your podcast and I heard all about deliberation, citizens' juries and da-da-da-da-da. And then when I got the invitation, I thought, oh, I know about this. I've heard it on Reasons to be Cheerful.
This is great. So last week we had somebody who's becoming a magistrate based on our podcast. This week, someone who joined a citizens' jury.
We're changing the world one step at a time, Jeff.
Reasons to be Cheerful with Ed Miliband and Jeff Lloyd.
Well, that takes us all very nicely to where we started. So thank you very much for listening. Back to Rory.
Thanks very much, David. And I'm glad you put that little Reasons to be Cheerful plug in. I had it prepared myself, but delighted that you've stuck it in. It's been one of my favourite bits of the assembly, hearing it go full circle like that. I've just got a couple more slides and they'll be very quick because I'm aware we need to have a bit of time for a chat. So I think you do anything off the back of this meeting, I'd encourage you to go to the website. David's mentioned it, peoplesplanfornature.org. I've pulled out all of the actions in this slide, which are directly relevant to business. You'll be able to find them yourselves. But there's going to be others in the plan which will get carryover for your business or for your sector. So I'd really encourage you to pull out an action, champion it, take action on it if you can. It's the people's plan, and we're encouraging folk to respond to it and respond to them in the way that they see fit, really. You can respond to the plan directly. You can take a couple of examples and do a detailed response. Us as commissioning organisations did that. And again, on the website, if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a bit that says responses. You can find our full responses there. We're really encouraging and championing people to respond and to make comment on what the content of the plan and what they might do differently. And of course, if you can champion it within your own sectors more widely, then it really encourage others to look at it, to adopt action, to take them forward, just like I hope you will. That'd be great. And there's, it's a resource really that shows actions which are sort of likely to be popular with a cross section of society, given the way the process works. So I recommend getting in there, getting involved. And as David says, all the talks are linked from the website as well, so you can see all the content. Some of it's absolutely brilliant. I'm just going to flag here that as part of our wider Save Our Wild Isles campaign, which you heard Ed Miliband referencing there, the three NGOs, RSPB, WWF and National Trust, have created 4 short films for business to raise awareness of the nature crisis, what it means for business, what can be done. So you can get involved in showing those films in your workplace. And the key thing is really about what actions flow from that, though. So what you might see in those films and what you've heard today from the People's Plans. So in addition to digging at the plan, adopting actions and responding, we encourage you to do things like assessing your impact and reliance on nature through your supply chain, developing targets to reduce this, creating transition plans, showing how you intend to tackle nature and climate issues, advocating for nature in your sector through your supply chain, with government, and identifying where you can give back. So, I mean, David's mentioned the idea of like going out and counting beetles or whatever it might be, or might be supporting action to restore rivers and wetlands. All that type of thing is great. I've stuck up my colleague Kim's contacts with her permission. She works on our business policy team. She's happy to take messages on behalf of the partnership if you've got queries about how to get involved with that side of it. And also to say thanks from me and from the Assembly itself as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you, David, as well. Really fascinating and an awful lot to dig into there. There are quite a few questions in the chat, and I'm conscious of where we are time-wise. Are you guys happy to open this up and answer some of these questions now? And everyone else, are you happy for us to maybe forego our breakout session time this time around, just because we're going to be pressed up quite close to time, and I'd like everyone to have an opportunity to ask David and Rory questions if you'd like to. Does that sit okay with everyone? There seem to be a lot of nods and okays and things, so let's do that. I'm just going to open it up. There are several questions in the chat which I can read, or you can ask the questions yourself. I'll go through them in order, and then if any other questions come up and we have time, we can go to those. So the first question that's come in is from Osbert. Do you want to ask that yourself, Osbert? No? Cool. So Osbert says, really interesting to hear how the process, he'd be really interested to hear how the process was transformative for participants. Do you see that as a core purpose or a side effect?
I presume I should take that and welcome David's reflections as well, because I think David's mentioned misgivings, but it's also been transformative in many ways for you, David, but I'm not here to put words in your mouth. I think I do. If this would be a very expensive way to do transformation for 100 people, right? So if you were just seeking to transform the lives of 100 folk, it's not the cheapest way to do it. However, it is part of the purpose, but of course the purpose is beyond that, because ultimately to affect change at the level that it needs to change, David put up that figure of what the current land use looks like in the UK, what the state of biodiversity loss has been. We need to operate at that level. So it needs to go beyond that. So core purpose of this for me really feels like demonstrating that people appraised of the issues recognize that they're important, there are things that we can do and that we should start doing them in the broadest sense. And then what that looks like, over to the plan and the people to have a think about what the best way to do that is. So that is more of a core purpose. But then, yes, absolutely, I think it is kind of a side effect of assemblies that this happens. But I think it is important that whatever we do, we start to build people's agency and involve people in these discussions. I think, of course, there is a role for experts and people who know their fields well. And it's really important to bring those voices to the fore. But historically, that's what we tend to do. And I think getting more people talking about the issues and creating space to converge and come together and think about the best way to do things is the way we're going to break out of often what becomes public debates, which are binary, which are right and wrong, black and white, and people get entrenched, and we don't solve issues that way. So it might be messy, it might be imperfect, but I think this is the way that we can sort of break through some of the public discourse, which can end up becoming very polarized about these issues.
I think it felt pretty premeditated to me. I think that the organizers knew what they were doing, and I'm admiring of the outcome. So although there were aspects of the process that I have misgivings about, there's nothing I want to say to negate the positiveness and the efforts that 100 of my fellow assembly members are making, and me too.
Thank you, guys. Gabriella, again, would you like to ask your question, or shall I ask it for you? I think we're on mute, so I'm going to ask Gabriella's question. So my question is really more of a curiosity. Being that we are in a small country by comparison to others, why is the state of affairs worse than others? She says, I think Rory said worse compared to other Western nations.
So I mean, actually globally, we're among the lower echelons in terms of biodiversity connectedness. There's been this big global study looking at various factors, and the UK as a whole is pretty low down. That's also broken into, because of the policy decisions and the governance is separated because of devolution. It's also broken down into the 4 countries, but no individual country is performing particularly well, and the UK overall is pretty low down there. And perhaps it's more of a, because it is a small island nation, that is part of the driving reason behind that. I also think it's perhaps something to do with how the model of conservation that we've adopted, possibly. The model that we have just now is kind of one of what's called sparing rather than sharing. There's more sharing starting to happen, but sparing as in, that's the bit for nature over there, here's the bit for food production, here's the bit for the city, here's the bit for this, the bit for that. And actually the model of the future has to be more integrated than that, has to be more about how the whole system, how everything as a whole operates, and not simply about, that's the bit for nature over there, here's the bit for industry or whatever else over here. Yes, that has to exist to some extent, but there's much more scope for sort of bleeding those boundaries. So, things like agroforestry, combining growing trees and natural habitats and farming all in the one place, and David pointed to some of that stuff. So why is it worse here? I think, we're sort of one of the cradles of the Industrial Revolution and developed quickly, and we're a small island nation. And I think those things are probably associated.
I think it's also relevant that we fought a war, and then farmers were then told, you've got to farm intensively in order to feed the population. And the farmers only did what they were told to and what they were incentivized to. Now those instructions and those incentives are changing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
Thank you. Next question is from Richard Bellas. Richard, do you want me to ask, or do you want to ask the question?
Well, I can ask it as I've written it. Because spaces like this are great at spreading the word. So, but I've said, what can we do about corporate PR and mainstream media, i.e. sharing more stories that matter and inspire encouragement, opportunity, agency? Or is it better to ignore this question and get on with what we're doing that's in front of us? Or is there something in the middle?
Well, ESG, environmental, social and governance, is a benchmark against which large companies are measuring themselves. My company, Operis, has about 80 employees. In a sense, we're too small to need an ESG policy. But we have one, not least because our clients, who are often the large banks, require to see it before they'll engage us. It is, if you look in, for example, the annual report of Shell or BP, there will be 10 or 12 pages dedicated to environmental matters now. I've read them very carefully. The Shell one is extremely convincing, and I am mystified by the protesters who gather at the Shell AGM, because Shell is actually one of the good guys with this. And you can look at the BP one, and it's not very convincing. So these firms do vary by the quality. It may just be that Shell has employed a better copywriter than BP has. But I don't think so. I think it is actually reflective of the firm's underlying values. So there's no shortage of attention being paid to these questions. But to repeat what I said earlier, businesses need a revenue model in order for them for this to be anything more than charity for them. That is coming, but I think it's early days for that.
I'm going to take a slightly not different view, but a different angle on answering this. I think it's what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, says. It's everything everywhere all at once. So yeah, there's not, yes, absolutely, sort of awareness raising the public and the media side of it. I mean, look at the difference in how the climate crisis is viewed now compared to the past. And yes, there are still some naysayers out there, but the discourse on that has moved significantly in the past few years. And we kind of need to match that with the nature crisis as well. I don't think it's as widely understood what the impacts and risks are from that. And they sit alongside each other. They are twin crises that are interwoven and interlinked, and the impacts of them will be negatively synergistic as well, right? So I think it's everything everywhere all at once. Of course, an instinct is, and David, you might have noticed this in the assembly, when people start hearing about the problems, one of the first things people say is, everyone needs to know this. We need to, the message needs to be awareness raising. And awareness raising is absolutely important. You can't expect to go to the next stage without being aware. But of course, it needs to go beyond awareness raising. We need to be doing the do as well. And the reality of conservation and protecting nature is we know how to do it. And we know how to do it in many and various ways in a multitude of contexts. So this isn't rocket science. Yes, there will be some problems that are stickier and harder than others, but I think most of the sticky hard problems are about how we make sure we do this stuff fairly, and we do it with people and not against people or to people. So I think, and it was really interesting to see for me that came through the assembly as well. So I think that's what's important, and we do need to get on with it, and the bigger and broader the church, the better. But yeah, the more media behind it, brilliant. But it's interesting for me how much of a push we made for the launch of the People's Plan, and Comms colleagues' feedback was this was hard work to sell this in. I think it's interesting of itself that people are coming together and having these discussions, and the sortition process that David described and everything else, the fact that is occurring, but it was quite a hard sell. We got decent press out of it, but not in the order of the type of thing that you would get for an economic story or other things that sort of dominate the news day to day.
Thanks both.
Thank you. There are a few, so there's a meaty question, if you pardon the expression, about plant-based options from Tracy, and a couple of questions. There's another one from Tracy higher up the list, and another one from Gabriella. I was going to move on to the bigger question and come back to those if we've got time, or if anyone else has got a question, because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. So moving on to Tracy's question, do you want to chip in yourself, Tracy, or do you
sure,
go for it?
Happy to. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
Marvelous. So the one regarding food, was it particularly?
I think that one.
Yeah.
It would be good to dig into. You can always ask, because I think the other question would be very quick.
Yeah, sure. So having attended COP26 up in Glasgow with a team of trustees and people from our environmental international reforestation charity, most of whom are either vegan, veggie, or pretty much, just down to a little bit of fish, because they understand the whole bigger, wider problems of the whole world and the need for a lighter footprint. We were shocked to find that the options for plant-based foods were awful. They really were terrible. And I've been to several other emergency climate crisis conferences where the predominant amount of food that's just been served as standard is meat. And a great deal of it is actually chucked away, because what's interesting is a lot of the delegates there were kind of leaning towards all the veggie options and not actually eating the meat. Is it that they're terrified of saying, let's offer a big, broad, wide selection of vegetables and plant-based foods, because there are so many things they could offer? They're just taking the safe option and having some meat, and that invariably ends up just getting chucked in the bin, and which is just astonishing. How do we get more event organizers and large organizations, businesses to say, increase your plant-based options because they are the lightest ones for the planet, and for ourselves, obviously, in wildlife and just ignoring all of those things, but just the planet. Just think of that. How do we do that? I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas.
This is the hot button issue, right? And it was one we addressed it in the assembly directly, actually, because as David showed from that figure, how we use the land to grow food is like the predominant land use in the UK. That is 72% of our land is used for agriculture, and the vast majority of that is used for raising animals. So it's a pressing issue. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to talk about this, because, and I think this is the reason people are nervous about addressing it, is food is deeply cultural, it's deeply social, the way people's diets have emerged. There's all sorts of stuff wrapped up in there that's not just about food, but is related to food, but it's related to family and religion and culture and any number of other things. So that's why it provokes such strong reactions from every single angle. But we were careful in presenting it because of that, but two, we presented it in a different way, in as much as we worked with Pete Smith, who was one of our academic leads and presented the sort of introductory presentation at the assembly. He's a soil scientist, very prestigious professor at Aberdeen Uni, absolutely, qualified up to the eyeballs. And he's been involved in this sort of issue of land use and what it means for soil health and everything else. And there's no other way to slice it, really. Now, some people in the climate perspective struggle with understanding the impacts, but when it comes to land use, the calculations are a bit easier and more visually easy to understand, I think. And I'd welcome David's reflections on this. This is what we presented in terms of this is how the land is being used in this country, and this is how much space it takes. And if the more meat you produce and dairy you produce, the more space you need to take up in order to produce that. So in terms of essentially it's maths, rather than a discussion about the specifics, and there needs to be a discussion about the specifics and how much less meat and dairy and whatever else need to be consumed. But where the assembly ended up was actually not making it just about personal choice. And I think this is where it falls down, is where it's always it's up to you as an individual to make your decision. Yes, personal choice needs to be there. People need to be able to have an element of agency and be able to make those choices. But there are ways to steer and support better choices. And it's what you've described there in the question, Tracy, is making sure that systems are set up to make it easy and actually make more of the offering about making sure it's plant-based and having a discussion about it as well. And actually, we did this at the assembly, and we had a big discussion about it beforehand. We were getting 103 strangers together, cross-section of the UK, again, representative of a whole variety of cultures, religions, lived experiences. And the menus, the evening menus and the lunch menus were like predominantly plant-based, but there were also meat options there. And we were careful about, we had a procurement policy, and we were clear about, where that should be sourced from, etc. But it was still offered, and we had a day that was the lunch was purely plant-based. And it's probably one of the things that we got the most negative feedback about from the assembly, was the day that it went purely plant-based.
Yeah, but that wasn't because it was plant-based. It was because it wasn't very good.
That's fair.
I understand what you're saying about the cultural challenges, and of course that is a very, very important, you know, part of why people choose food. It's what you have, it's what you've always had. But there are some interesting people stepping forward with plant-based options based on those cultural thoughts and traditions that people don't want to break, but we're going to have to look at alternatives to things. So yes, David, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I remember going to the house of a friend when I was 10 years old, and we had lunch, and lunch was spaghetti bolognese. I had never seen spaghetti in my life before then. It's not something my parents ate. I was about 17 when I had Indian food for the first time. The way the children's generation eats is just different from the way our parents ate. And what that tells me is that change is possible. It may take a generation or two, but in the scheme of things, that's not a huge length of time. And I am sure that these changes will happen. And there was a question earlier on about where is plant-based fake meat grown? And I'm no expert in this. There are lots of technologies. A lot of them are based on soya. The soya-based ones, I'm told that it takes more of the world's resources to make a plant-based burger than it does to use a cow to do the same job. But the idea is that the belief behind this is that this is a technological problem, and just as computers have got twice as fast every 18 months and half the price, similarly technology will bring these new plant-based processes to bear. But at the moment I've certainly read evidence that it's no cheaper and in fact maybe worse. So you have to believe that what in the computer industry is Moore's law, that these things will get better exponentially, will apply. Will it? I don't know.
One final thing is the soy argument is very frequently put forward, and the truth and the reality of that is very shocking. And it is that the predominant amount of soy that is grown is for cow feed. It's not for vegans. It's not for plant-based people. It is to feed animals who, of course, are not designed to eat soy. They're designed to eat grass. And they're actually creating holes in the side of some cows in places where they're intensively feeding them things that they're not meant to eat, and that's so that they can put their hands in and move them along. It's absolute fact. The soy argument is always used, and it is absolutely untrue, really shockingly untrue. But yeah, it is a big can of worms. So thank you for your thoughts on those, both of you, very much indeed.
Thanks, Tracy. I just want to say I waffled a bit. Where I was getting to was really that actually it's structural and systemic, the thing that needs to happen. So there's been a focus on a personal choice element, and it's not changed the game substantively. Yes, things are going in the right direction, but unless there is something more structural. So, for example, procurement for a local authority or something like that, or running events like you've described, is a way to start saying, right, this is what's going to be put on offer. We are going to consider that impact in our business model and on the supply chain. A lot of the problem with and my direct experience from the assembly and in other places, and my previous day job was working on seafood supply chains, which is notoriously not particularly transparent. There are the challenges that there are so many steps, and it's the responsibility is delegated to somebody else. And if you are purely reliant on the sustainability statement on some food supply operator's website, you might think, oh, everything's fine. If you don't know the information and you can't interrogate it. Now, I'm a seafood nerd and was able to go and look at the supplier for the hotel that we were running the assembly in and say, well, no, this says this, and you're offering sea bass. That's actually on this red list, and if it's from the channel, that's no good, and if it's from there. But it needs that level of interrogation, and who's got the time? And which CSR folk in businesses have the time and the expertise to sit and interrogate every single example of every single bit of supply chain. So it needs to be not that we hove it off into individual people's jobs to be and do everything, but rather it's a little bit of everyone's job, and let's make it easier. Just make it easier to make a better or different choice, and people will start making those choices. I think. But of course, I think the reality is in the UK, I think meat is still going to be in the table. I personally don't eat any meat and haven't for many years, but it's still going to be in the table. And I think that is okay. That's fine. I think the discussion ends up being you have to be this or you have to be this. The impact of many people, the entire population having a bit less would actually be, much better than us sitting and having a debate about whether you're holier than thou or not.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We're approaching time. Has anyone else got any question they want to ask? If you want to pop your hand up if anyone else has got something that they'd like to add at this point. Oh, there's a finger up there from Emma. Go
on. Yes. Thank you so much. Gosh, I feel like we could stay on for ages talking about all of this. And I'm sat in a place where it's going to be another 40-degree day, and this is just unreal. Shouldn't be happening. What I found really awesome was having somebody on to this session today that's actually talking about being able to properly lobby for change and things. But I've got two tiny questions. One of them is, you can probably send us a link afterwards. You were talking about how important it is to know we can truly make change individually. And one of those things could be counting beetles and, butterflies and all that sort of thing. Where can we get, I guess there's some information on the RSPB, website, but how can we find out how to get involved with things like that? And the other one is, why can't every home that's built have a solar roof and a heat pump? And what about living roofs and windmills on houses? Why can't that start now? Can you do anything to help with that, basically?
Well, if I can pick up on the heat pump one, it's deeply frustrating to me to see that we've got areas of government that are trying to promote energy efficiency, and their efforts are sabotaged by other areas of government. So if you've got a listed building, you may not even repair the windows or replace the windows. You've got to patch the old ones. Where I live, I've looked at this. If you want a heat pump, it mustn't be visible from the street. It mustn't be within a meter of your boundary. It mustn't be within 4 meters of anyone's bedroom. If you want to put it on a roof, it may not be a pitched roof. And when you combine all those things, there's literally nowhere to put it in a central London terraced house. And you go and ask your local authority what they're doing about this, and they just sort of look blankly at you. You might as well be trying to have a conversation with a giraffe about relativity. It is extraordinary how unconnected the different bits of government are. But certainly you've got people like English Heritage who are going around preventing changes to buildings that would actually make them habitable. It's deeply frustrating to me to watch this happen. So why can't modern developments have heat pumps on? Probably because the planning laws don't allow it. So these things have got to be relaxed.
Wow. Okay, I didn't realize. Very interesting. Well, let's hope we can keep pressing the message then.
Well, do check in your local authority to see what the rules are. There's a sort of default set of rules that most authorities have adopted because they can't be bothered to make any of their own. But yours might have done something more proactive on its own, and the rules might be different where you live.
I've just availed myself of what was an interest-free loan with cashback, but is now a grant from the Scottish Government to get an air source heat pump. And yes, a number of those rules that David described are the case for me. But I'm on the outskirts of Glasgow in the suburbs, and I've got that metre of space, which is probably worth £7 million in central London. But yeah, it's there are some mechanisms there, but they're actually very badly publicised. And I only found out actually from the heat pump supplier yesterday when he came over to do another assessment that you can actually ask for 60% of the money up front. In the agreement that I've got, it's not clear at all, and I thought I'm having to get money from elsewhere to pay for parts of the the job up front. I mean, even the basics of like, this money's there and you can get 60% of it up front are not clear. And I'm somebody who cares and is interested.
Yes.
Like, the barriers should not be that high.
And as a side note, for Devon, there's definitely grants for solar panels and heat pump. The caveat to that is the suppliers are having tons of work, so delays, and they're finding it hard to get the money. But the money is supposed to be there. Whether it arrives or not, it's a different story. But it's supposed to be there, something like between 5 and 10 grand, depending on what you choose.
Thanks, Gabriella, for chipping in with that. Now, I think we're pretty much up with time, guys. I just wanted to say, really, just a massive thank you to Rory and David and to everyone involved in the conversation. In my view, it's not that often that you have conversations in which there are obviously slightly opposing views coming out in the conversation, but that those are handled in a way that is really generative and positive, and that everyone gets to contribute in a way that feels like we're actually debating something sensibly and talking about something where we're all heading in the same direction together, regardless of the fact that we may not completely agree. So for me, that's really heartening, and I've really thoroughly enjoyed spending the time listening to you all. So thank you, and thank you so much to David and to Rory, if we want to give them a quick round of applause, and a thank you for all of your time, guys, today.